The Quiet Neighbors, Uncovering the Dark Secret of Willow Creek, a thrilling tale of deception. Chapter 1, A Warm Welcome. Claire Harris had always thought of small towns as safe havens, places where the world slowed down just enough to catch your breath. After everything that had happened, Willow Creek seemed like the kind of place where she could finally do just that, start anew, heal, and maybe even forget. The winding roads leading to the town were flanked by trees that stood like silent sentinels, their leaves whispering secrets in the wind. It was autumn, and the air held that crisp promise of change, the kind she was desperate to embrace. The town itself was like something out of a storybook, each house a perfect replica of the next, with manicured lawns and flowers blooming in neat, tidy rows. Claire's car rolled down Main Street, past the whitewashed church, the quaint bakery, and the small grocery store, all of which seemed frozen in time. The people she passed waved in unison, their faces lit up with smiles that were almost too warm, too welcoming, like the kind you give to an old friend you haven't seen in years. Yet, there was something about those smiles that unsettled her. They were like the porcelain dolls she used to keep on her shelf as a child, beautiful but empty. Her new home, a Victorian beauty at the end of Maple Lane, stood apart from the rest, both in distance and demeanor. It was an old house, the kind that had lived through generations, each one leaving its mark in the creaking floorboards and faded wallpaper. The moment Claire stepped through the front door, she felt a shiver run down her spine, a fleeting chill that was gone as quickly as it came. She shook it off, attributing it to her overactive imagination, the same one that had kept her awake at night in the weeks leading up to this move. The house was more than she had hoped for. High ceilings, large windows that let in streams of sunlight, and a sprawling yard that seemed to stretch on forever. It was almost too perfect, and she couldn't help but wonder why the previous owner had left so suddenly. The real estate agent had been vague, mentioning only that the owner had relocated unexpectedly. The price had been a steal, but the agent's evasiveness lingered in Claire's mind like a forgotten word on the tip of her tongue. As she unpacked her belongings, the house remained eerily quiet, as if it were holding its breath, waiting for something. The silence was broken only by the occasional creak of the wooden floorboards beneath her feet. At night, the house seemed to come alive with strange, barely audible sounds, a soft rustling, a distant thud, the faintest of whispers. She told herself it was just the house settling, a natural occurrence in a place this old. Still, she found herself glancing over her shoulder more often than she liked. The neighbors, though outwardly friendly, maintained a curious distance. They would wave from across the street, but none of them crossed the threshold of her yard. Claire assumed it was just the way of small towns, where everyone knew everyone else's business, but kept to themselves nonetheless. But as the days passed, she couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more to their reserve, something that lay beneath the surface of their carefully curated politeness. One evening, as she sat on her porch sipping tea and watching the sun dip below the horizon, she noticed a group of them standing in the street, their eyes fixed on her house. They were speaking in low tones, too quiet for her to make out the words, and when they saw her watching, they quickly dispersed, each one heading in a different direction as if nothing had happened. Claire's heart quickened, but she forced herself to stay calm. They were probably just curious about the newcomer, she reasoned. After all, she was the stranger here, the one who didn't quite belong. Yet, as the sun set and the shadows lengthened, Claire couldn't ignore the gnawing sense of unease that had taken root within her. Willow Creek might have appeared picture-perfect on the outside, but there was something beneath the surface, something she couldn't quite put her finger on, something that made the town's warm embrace feel just a little too tight. And in the stillness of the night, as she lay in bed listening to the house murmur its secrets, Claire couldn't help but wonder if she had made a terrible mistake. Chapter 2, The Rituals. In Willow Creek, the days blurred together in a sequence of sunlit mornings and calm, uneventful afternoons. Claire had almost convinced herself that the unsettling moments she'd experienced were simply the product of an overactive mind. The town was quiet, peaceful even, and yet there was a thread of tension woven into the fabric of everyday life, a tension she couldn't quite shake. It was during the evenings, just after the sun dipped below the horizon, that the peculiarities began to reveal themselves. Claire would watch from her window as the townspeople emerged from their homes, moving with an odd, synchronized purpose. They would gather in clusters along the streets, their heads bowed together as they murmured in hushed tones. Though she couldn't hear what they were saying, their glances, fleeting but unmistakably directed at her house, were enough to set her on edge. It was during one of these evenings, while Claire was finishing dinner, that she noticed something new. As she stood by the window, washing her dishes, she spotted a small group of her neighbors across the street. They were placing something on the ground, just at the edge of her yard. She squinted, trying to make out what it was, but before she could, they quickly dispersed, slipping back into the shadows as if they'd never been there. Curiosity got the better of her. Claire dried her hands and stepped outside, the cool air biting at her skin as she approached the spot where they had been. At her feet lay a small sprig of herbs tied neatly with a piece of twine. A few feet away, there was a smooth, round stone, and just beyond that, a single feather, white and delicate, as if it had drifted down from the sky. The objects seemed harmless enough, yet their presence filled her with an inexplicable dread. She bent down, hesitating for a moment before picking up the sprig of herbs. It was rosemary, its scent sharp and earthy. She turned it over in her hands, the leaves brushing against her fingers as she tried to decipher its meaning. The following day, Claire decided to make an effort to integrate into the community. She had been in Willow Creek long enough to warrant an appearance at one of the town's gatherings, and besides, she was determined to make sense of the oddities she had been witnessing. A town meeting was scheduled for that evening, and she thought it would be the perfect opportunity to meet more of the locals and perhaps get some answers. The meeting was held in the town hall, a modest building with creaking wooden floors and walls lined with photographs of Willow Creek's past. The townspeople filed in quietly, each taking their seat with a nod to their neighbor, their expressions as unreadable as ever. Claire found a seat near the back, hoping to observe without drawing too much attention to herself. As the meeting began, Claire introduced herself to the woman next to her, a stern-looking individual with gray hair pulled into a tight bun. The woman smiled, though like the others, it didn't reach her eyes, and returned the introduction with a brief nod. Claire tried to engage her in conversation, asking innocuous questions about the town and its history, but the woman's answers were vague, her tone politely dismissive. It was as if there were certain topics that simply weren't up for discussion. Then, Mrs. Whitaker, the town's mayor, rose to speak. She was an imposing figure, her presence commanding the room without effort. Her voice was soft, yet it carried a weight that made everyone fall silent as she addressed the gathering. She welcomed Claire warmly, her eyes lingering on her for just a moment longer than was comfortable. "We're a community bound by tradition," Mrs. Whitaker said, her gaze fixed on Claire. "It's important to respect what has come before us and to keep with the old ways." Claire felt a chill as Mrs. Whitaker's words hung in the air, their meaning as elusive as everything else in Willow Creek. She wanted to ask about the house, about the strange gatherings and the objects left at her door, but something in Mrs. Whitaker's eyes stopped her. Instead, she nodded, forcing a smile as the mayor continued with the meeting, her words slipping into the background as Claire's thoughts raced. That night, long after the meeting had ended, Claire sat in her living room, the objects she had collected earlier spread out on the coffee table in front of her. They seemed so insignificant, so ordinary, and yet the way they had been placed, deliberate, almost ritualistic, made her uneasy. She couldn't shake the feeling that they were meant for her, a message in a language she didn't understand. It was well past midnight when she finally decided to go to bed, her mind still churning over the day's events. As she pulled the covers up to her chin, she heard it again, a noise outside, faint but unmistakable. Her heart pounded in her chest as she slipped out of bed and tiptoed to the window. Peering through the curtains, she saw them, the same group of neighbors from earlier, standing in her yard, their faces turned up toward her window. They were silent, their eyes fixed on her with an intensity that sent a shiver down her spine. She stood frozen, unsure of what to do, her breath caught in her throat. Finally, mustering all the courage she could, she flung open the window and called out to them. "What are you doing?" she demanded, her voice trembling more than she'd intended. For a moment, they didn't move, didn't speak. Then, as one, they turned and walked away, disappearing into the night without a word. Claire stood there, the cold air rushing in around her, the curtains billowing in the wind. She felt as if she had just witnessed something she was never meant to see, something that couldn't be explained by reason or logic. And as she closed the window and backed away from it, her heart still racing, she knew that whatever was happening in Willow Creek, it was far from over. Chapter 3: The Town's History. The days in Willow Creek had taken on a disquieting rhythm, each one slipping into the next with a growing sense of unease. Claire's once determined efforts to acclimate to her new surroundings had shifted to something more akin to survival. The small town, which had first appeared to be a sanctuary, now felt like a carefully constructed facade, one she was increasingly desperate to see behind. Claire could no longer ignore the mounting strangeness around her. The peculiar rituals, the unnerving gatherings at dusk, and the odd offerings left at her doorstep had all begun to weigh heavily on her mind. Something was profoundly wrong in Willow Creek, and Claire knew she had to uncover what it was, no matter the cost. Her search for answers led her to the local library, an unassuming building nestled between the post office and a general store. The librarian, a frail woman with thinning white hair and spectacles perched on the edge of her nose, greeted Claire with the same too bright smile she had come to expect from the townspeople. But beneath the woman's polite exterior, Claire sensed an eagerness to end their interaction quickly. Undeterred, she asked for any information on the town's history, particularly anything relating to her home. The librarian hesitated, her smile faltering for just a second before she led Claire to a dusty section of the library filled with old records and yellowed books. "Not many people ask about the past," the librarian remarked, her tone betraying a hint of caution. "But feel free to browse." Claire spent hours poring over the ancient volumes, her fingers growing smudged with dust and ink. As the daylight outside waned, she stumbled upon a faded, leather-bound book with the town's name embossed on the cover. Inside, she found what she had been dreading, a detailed account of her home's dark legacy. The house had once belonged to a woman named Eliza Harper, a figure whose name had long been whispered with a mix of fear and reverence. In the 1800s, Eliza had been accused of witchcraft, a claim fueled by a series of mysterious misfortunes that had plagued the town. Crops had withered, livestock had fallen ill, and the townspeople, desperate for a scapegoat, had turned their suspicions toward Eliza. Though no trial ever took place and no formal charges were brought against her, the town had shunned her, believing she had cursed them in retaliation. Eliza had died in her home, alone and ostracized, her death marking the beginning of a series of strange events that seemed to be tied to the house itself. Over the years, those who lived in the house reported hearing whispers in the night, seeing shadowy figures, and feeling an ever-present sense of being watched. Many had left abruptly, never to return. As Claire read on, the words blurred together, a growing sense of dread settling in her chest. The accounts seemed to echo her own experiences. Was she, too, becoming another victim of the house's dark history? Determined to learn more, Claire decided to search her own home for clues. That evening, she ascended to the attic, a part of the house she had thus far avoided. The air was thick with dust, the wooden floorboards creaking underfoot as she explored the dimly lit space. It wasn't long before she found it, a small, weathered chest tucked away in a corner, nearly hidden beneath a pile of old blankets. Her hands trembled as she opened the chest, revealing its contents, a collection of yellowed papers, brittle with age, and a worn, leather-bound diary. She picked up the diary, the leather cool and smooth against her skin, and began to read. The diary belonged to the previous owner, a woman named Margaret Avery. As Claire flipped through the pages, Margaret's words revealed a familiar story, one of initial excitement at the prospect of a new beginning in Willow Creek, followed by a gradual descent into fear and isolation. Margaret wrote of hearing voices, of seeing figures that vanished when she turned to face them. She spoke of the neighbors, of their strange customs, and how their friendly demeanor hid something much darker. The final entries were frantic, the handwriting nearly illegible as Margaret described her growing paranoia. She wrote of nightmares that plagued her sleep, vivid and terrifying dreams where Eliza Harper appeared, her presence suffocating and inescapable. In the last entry, Margaret wrote of her decision to leave, convinced that staying in the house any longer would be her undoing. As Claire closed the diary, she felt the walls of the attic closing in around her. The stories she had read mirrored her own experience too closely to dismiss. She now knew she wasn't imagining things. Something malevolent was at work in Willow Creek, something that had claimed the lives and sanity of those who came before her. In the days that followed, Claire's unease grew into full-blown paranoia. The townspeople seemed to sense her fear, their behavior becoming more intrusive with each passing day. The gifts they left on her doorstep became increasingly elaborate, small sculptures of twisted branches, jars of strange-smelling liquids, and once a bird's skull carefully placed in a velvet-lined box. They began to insist on her attendance at town events, their invitations leaving little room for refusal. And then there were the dreams. Every night, without fail, Claire found herself trapped in the same nightmare, Eliza Harper's cold eyes boring into hers as she tried to escape the confines of her own mind. The line between reality and dreams began to blur, and Claire felt the grip of the town closing in on her, tightening with every breath. But Claire wasn't ready to give up. Not yet. There had to be a way out of this, a way to break free from whatever curse had taken hold of her and her home. She would find it, no matter what it took. Chapter 4. The Gathering. The invitation arrived in a plain envelope, slipped under Claire's door one morning. The parchment was thick, the ink carefully scrawled in an elegant, old-fashioned script. "You are cordially invited to attend the Willow Creek Harvest Festival," it read, with the date and time listed below. There was no RSVP, no indication of where the festival would be held, as if it were simply understood that everyone would know. Claire stared at the invitation, a deep sense of foreboding settling in her chest. She had heard whispers about the festival from the neighbors, vague, cryptic references that seemed to carry an unspoken significance. Now, holding the invitation in her hands, she felt as though she were being drawn into something far beyond her understanding. Yet, despite her reservations, Claire knew she had no choice. The pressure from the townspeople had been mounting, their insistence on her participation growing with each passing day. Perhaps the festival would provide the answers she sought, reveal the truth about the town and its unnerving traditions. Perhaps it was her only chance to finally understand the nightmare she had walked into. When the evening of the festival arrived, Claire dressed in her best, though she couldn't shake the feeling that she was preparing for something far more sinister than a simple celebration. The walk to the town square was eerily quiet, the streets deserted save for the occasional flicker of candlelight in the windows. It was as if the entire town was holding its breath, waiting. The square was transformed. Lanterns hung from every tree, casting an unnatural, flickering light over the scene. Stalls were set up, selling all manner of goods, jars of preserves, woven baskets, carved wooden figures, but there was something off about it all. The air was thick with the scent of burning herbs, and the laughter of the townsfolk seemed forced, hollow. Claire was greeted warmly, with an enthusiasm that felt unnervingly rehearsed. As she made her way through the crowd, she noticed how everyone's eyes seemed to linger on her just a little too long, their smiles stretching a little too wide. It was as if they were waiting for something only she could give them. Mrs. Whitaker appeared at her side, seemingly out of nowhere, her grip on Claire's arm firm but deceptively gentle. "You've made it, my dear," she said, her voice syrupy sweet. "We were all hoping you would join us. Tonight is a very special night." Claire nodded, too wary to refuse, as Mrs. Whitaker led her deeper into the throng. The crowd parted for them, and Claire felt their eyes boring into her, a collective gaze that made her skin crawl. They reached a large bonfire in the center of the square, the flames licking high into the night sky, casting dancing shadows on the faces of those gathered around. The festival's rituals began in earnest then, strange and alien to Claire's eyes. There was singing, a haunting melody that seemed to echo from the depths of the earth itself. The townspeople danced in slow, deliberate movements, their steps measured and precise, as if part of a well-rehearsed performance. Claire stood at the edge, feeling more like an outsider than ever, though it was clear she was the focus of the night's events. At first, the festival seemed like an elaborate, if unsettling, reenactment of some ancient custom. But as the night wore on, the atmosphere shifted, becoming more intense, more charged. The townsfolk's behavior grew increasingly frenzied, their voices rising in unison, their eyes shining with a fervor that bordered on madness. Claire's discomfort grew with every passing moment. She felt suffocated by the attention, trapped in a place where the line between reality and ritual had blurred beyond recognition. And then, as she stood at the edge of the bonfire's light, she heard them, the voices that had haunted her since she arrived in Willow Creek. Mrs. Whitaker was speaking in hushed tones to another town elder, a man Claire had seen around but never met. Their voices were low, but the urgency in their words was unmistakable. Claire edged closer, straining to hear over the din of the festival. "It must be done tonight," Mrs. Whitaker was saying, her voice taut with tension. "The pact must be honored, or we all risk losing everything." "And you're certain she's the one?" the man asked, his tone one of wary disbelief. "She must be," Mrs. Whitaker replied, her voice dropping even lower. "The signs are all there. She's living in that house, and the spirit has accepted her. The rituals have held so far, but we can't risk another year without the proper sacrifice." Claire's blood ran cold as the truth began to dawn on her. She was the sacrifice. This whole town, these quiet, polite neighbors, were bound by an ancient and terrible pact. The prosperity and peace they enjoyed came at a cost, one paid by those unfortunate enough to live in the cursed house at the edge of town. The realization hit her like a physical blow. She felt the ground shift beneath her feet, the world spinning out of control. The smiles, the whispers, the gifts, they had all been leading to this moment, a moment she now knew she had to escape from, or she would never leave Willow Creek alive. But as Claire turned to flee, she felt a hand on her shoulder, gripping her with an unexpected strength. Mrs. Whitaker stood behind her, her eyes no longer the kind, gentle gaze Claire had first known. They were cold, calculating, the eyes of someone who had long ago accepted the darkness that ruled this town. "Stay, my dear," Mrs. Whitaker said, her voice a chilling whisper. "The night is just beginning." Chapter 5: The Confrontation. The night air was thick, with the scent of smoke and damp earth as Claire stumbled away from the bonfire, her heart pounding in her chest. Mrs. Whitaker's icy grip still burned on her shoulder, the weight of the town's dark secret pressing down on her like a suffocating shroud. The revelation had shaken her to her core, but it also ignited something fierce and unyielding within her. She wasn't going to let them control her. She wouldn't allow herself to be sacrificed to their twisted tradition. But the farther she moved from the square, the more she realized the depth of the trap that had been laid for her. Every street she turned onto led back to the same familiar places: the post office, the general store, the library. It was as if the town itself was conspiring to keep her there, its layout a maze designed to confuse and entrap. Claire quickened her pace, her thoughts racing. The roads leading out of Willow Creek had been blocked by cars, by impassable piles of debris, by silent, watchful figures who stood in the shadows, their eyes glinting in the dim light. It became clear that the entire town was in on it, each and every person playing their part in this macabre ritual. Panic set in as she realized there was no clear way out. Desperation gnawed at her as she fled back to the only place that seemed to offer a semblance of sanctuary, her house, the very epicenter of the town's malevolent history. Her breath came in ragged gasps as she pushed open the front door and stumbled inside, slamming it shut behind her. For a brief moment, the familiar surroundings of her Victorian home felt almost comforting, a barrier between her and the madness outside. But the illusion of safety shattered the instant she heard the soft, measured footsteps approaching from the hallway. Claire spun around, her back pressed against the door, and found herself facing Mrs. Whitaker, flanked by a small group of townspeople. Their expressions were grim, their eyes hard with a resolve that sent chills down Claire's spine. Mrs. Whitaker stepped forward, her hands folded neatly in front of her, the epitome of cold detachment. "It's time we had a talk, Claire," she said, her voice devoid of the warmth it once held. "I'm sure by now you've come to understand why you're here, why this town has welcomed you so eagerly." Claire felt her pulse quicken, but she forced herself to stand tall, to meet the old woman's gaze with a steely determination of her own. "I'm not going to be your scapegoat," she said, her voice shaking only slightly. "You can't force me to stay here. I won't be a prisoner in this house." A murmur rippled through the group, a mixture of pity and resignation. Mrs. Whitaker's lips pressed into a thin line, her eyes narrowing. "You misunderstand, dear," she said quietly. "This isn't about force. It's about necessity. The spirit of this house, of this town, it demands a presence, someone to anchor it, to keep it appeased. Without you, the curse will return, and this place will wither and die." Claire shook her head, disbelief and anger warring within her. "You're all insane," she whispered. "You're willing to sacrifice me to save yourselves? This is monstrous." "It's tradition," Mrs. Whitaker corrected, her voice sharp. "A tradition that has kept Willow Creek prosperous and safe for generations. The previous owner understood this, but she was weak. She ran when her time came. But you, Claire, you've been chosen. The house has accepted you, and there's no running from that." The townspeople moved closer, their faces impassive, their eyes dark with the weight of centuries-old belief. Claire felt a wave of nausea wash over her as she realized just how deeply rooted this ritual was, how firmly these people believed in its power. But even as fear threatened to overwhelm her, she knew she couldn't give in. She wouldn't let them control her fate. "I don't care what you believe," Claire said, her voice growing stronger. "I'm leaving, and there's nothing you can do to stop me." A silence fell over the room, thick and heavy. Mrs. Whitaker's expression softened, almost as if she pitied Claire. "You can't leave," she said softly. "The town won't let you. The spirit won't let you. This house won't let you." Claire's heart skipped a beat as she realized the truth in the woman's words. The house itself seemed to pulse with a malevolent energy, a living entity that had ensnared her from the moment she set foot inside. But Claire refused to let that paralyze her. If the house was alive, if it was somehow connected to the spirit, then it could be fought. "Watch me," Claire spat, pushing past Mrs. Whitaker and the others, heading for the door. But as she reached for the doorknob, she felt an invisible force pushing back, resisting her every move. It was as if the air had thickened, become a solid wall that kept her trapped inside. She fought against it, her desperation mounting, but it was useless. The house had her now, its ancient grip tightening around her like a vice. Claire's breath hitched in her throat as she felt the cold, insidious presence of the spirit creeping into her mind, whispering of surrender, of acceptance. But Claire wasn't ready to surrender. Not yet. With a surge of defiance, she turned to face Mrs. Whitaker, her eyes blazing with fury. "If you think I'm going to just sit here and let you all sacrifice me, you're wrong," she said. "I'll find a way out. I'll break your curse, even if it's the last thing I do." Mrs. Whitaker met her gaze, her expression inscrutable. "You'll see, Claire," she said softly, almost gently. "In time, you'll come to understand. This is bigger than all of us." But Claire wasn't listening. She was already plotting her next move, already searching for a way to defy the town, to escape the clutches of the spirit and the house that had claimed her. She wouldn't go quietly. She wouldn't be their uninvited guest any longer. She would fight. Chapter 6, The Twist. Claire's hands trembled as she swept the last of the ritual objects into a box, her breath quickening with each item she discarded. The sprigs of dried herbs, the stones, the feathers, they were meaningless, nothing more than tokens of a lie that had bound the town of Willow Creek in chains of its own making. Each object that hit the bottom of the box felt like a small victory, a step closer to breaking free from the nightmare she had unwittingly become a part of. She had come to realize, with a clarity that frightened her, that the curse was nothing but a grotesque fabrication, a story conjured from the shadows of guilt and dread that had festered within the townspeople for generations. The woman accused of witchcraft, the one whose spirit supposedly haunted her every night, was not the malevolent force she had been made out to be. Instead, she was a victim of the same twisted fear that now gripped the town. As the last object clattered into the box, Claire felt a surge of defiance. This was her house now, her life. She would not allow herself to be shackled by the delusions of a town too cowardly to face its own reflection. The dreams, the whispers, they had been nothing more than echoes of the past, amplified by the collective paranoia of Willow Creek. Taking the box, she marched out to the backyard, where the autumn air was thick with the scent of decaying leaves. Without a second thought, she tipped the contents into a small pit she had dug earlier and set them alight. The flames licked at the dry materials, consuming them quickly, leaving behind only ashes and smoke. Claire stood back, watching the fire burn, feeling the oppressive weight of the town's history lift from her shoulders. But as the flames died down, she felt something else, something darker, stir in the air. It wasn't the spirit of the witch, but rather the realization that what she had destroyed wasn't just a collection of meaningless trinkets. It was the foundation upon which Willow Creek had built its fragile sense of peace and order. And now that foundation was crumbling. The first sign came as a whisper, carried on the wind, a murmur of voices rising in anger and confusion. Claire turned toward the town, her heart pounding as she heard the growing din. The polite masks that the townspeople wore had begun to slip, revealing the deep-seated resentments and madness that had been simmering beneath the surface all along. The streets that had once been so orderly, so neat, were now teeming with chaos. People argued in the open, shouting accusations, their eyes wild with fear and betrayal. The houses that had stood as symbols of the town's prosperity now loomed ominously, their windows dark, their doors shut tight against the coming storm. Claire knew she had to leave. The town was unraveling, its sanity fraying at the edges, and she could feel the darkness closing in. Grabbing her keys, she ran to her car, her mind racing. She had to get out before the town consumed itself completely, before the madness overtook her as well. As she sped down the winding road that led out of Willow Creek, she glanced back one last time. The town, once so picture-perfect, was now a smudge of shadows against the darkening sky. She could almost hear the echoes of the townspeople's voices, their cries of panic and rage as their world disintegrated. But Claire didn't look back again. She focused on the road ahead, the lines blurring as she pushed the car faster, farther away from the place that had nearly ensnared her. The night was deepening, the stars obscured by clouds, but she felt a strange sense of peace, a calm that came from knowing she had broken free. As the miles stretched out before her, she reflected on all that had happened. The rituals, the fear, the lies, they were all symptoms of a deeper sickness, one that had festered in the hearts of the people of Willow Creek. They had allowed their fear to dictate their lives, to bind them to a tradition that was nothing more than a prison of their own making. Claire knew now that she had been the catalyst, the one who had disrupted the fragile balance that had kept the town from tearing itself apart. But she also knew that it wasn't her responsibility to save them. They had to face their own demons, confront the darkness they had allowed to grow unchecked for so long. And as she drove into the night, leaving Willow Creek far behind, Claire knew she had learned a lesson that would stay with her forever. The true danger lies not in the unknown, but in the fear of it. And in that fear, the real monsters are born.